Pat Nixon embodied and applied the spirit of volunteerism. As Second Lady, she ignored convention and pioneered new traditions by insisting that in addition to the traditional official receptions and formal events, her schedule always included schools and hospitals and orphanages. In 1955, she ruffled feathers but won hearts when she visited a leper colony in Panama. On May 31, 1970, Peru was hit by a devastating earthquake. It is still Peru's most catastrophic natural disaster and one of the 10 most destructive quakes in the history of the world. President Nixon acted, mobilizing American resources and allocating $10 million for a Peruvian relief program. The relations between the two nations had been strained, and this immediate and pragmatic response made a powerful impression. Pat Nixon was touched when she read the reports and saw the heart-rending images. Typically, she wanted to help. She decided to go to Peru herself, bringing a plane load of vitally needed relief supplies and demonstrating the concern and compassion of the President and the American people. Her historic visit was a personal mission, a humanitarian triumph, and a diplomatic coup. To mark this 109th birthday, the Richard Nixon Foundation asked historian, curator, and author Heath Lee, who is currently researching a biography of Pat Nixon, to take an in-depth look at the First Lady's historic mercy mission to Peru.
On May 31st of 1970, the Great Peruvian Earthquake hit the coastal town of Chimbote, Peru. It was a 7.9 on the Richter scale. 70,000 died, 50,000 were injured, and 800,000 were left homeless. In landslides after the quake, entire villages were destroyed. A wall of ice, mud, and snow came loose from Peru's highest mountain after the quake. It buried the entire town of Yungay. All that remained was a statue of Christ above the city cemetery and the tops of 4 90-foot palm trees. The only ones spared were a group of children attending a hillside circus that day. All were orphaned by the landslide. Pat Nixon witnessed these horrific events on television in the United States. She was so deeply disturbed by the scenes of devastation she saw, she felt she must do something personally to help. President Nixon encouraged her to go solo to the scene of the disaster. On June 28, 1970, Mrs. Nixon flew to Peru on Air Force One with another jet in tow, carrying tons of relief supplies to Lima, Peru. Mrs. Nixon also brought members of the United States press with her and $25,000 in relief checks written to her personally. The goal of the trip was to bring food, medical supplies, and other useful items to those in need, but also for Mrs. Nixon to use her platform as First Lady to focus world attention on the Peruvians' plight. This would and did encourage other countries to also send relief and supplies to Peru. After arriving in Lima, Mrs. Nixon was greeted by Consuelo Velasco, the First Lady of Peru. Mrs. Nixon's prior global travels and love of people allowed her to make an instant warm connection with Mrs. Velasco. The two women hit it off and often walked arm in arm together during the trip. The next morning, the supplies were loaded onto a cargo plane, taking Mrs. Nixon, Mrs. Velasco, and a few members of the press deep into the Andes Mountains, where they made a dangerous landing on a dirt strip. Mrs. Nixon sat in a kitchen chair bolted to the floor of the plane with no seatbelt, while Mrs. Velasco sat in the co-pilot's seat. When they disembarked, the two women took a Marine helicopter to the worst hit areas and spent 5 hours picking through the rubble of demolished homes. In her aqua suit and heels, Mrs. Nixon hugged children, held the hands of villagers, met the people on the ground, and empathized with their situation. Mrs. Velasco, used to more formal interactions with the Peruvian people, followed suit. She followed Mrs. Nixon's lead, hugging children and talking person to person with those she encountered. The next day, the two women met with leaders of volunteer agencies as well as more everyday people affected by the quake. At the Hospital del Niños, Mrs. Nixon hugged survivors, children orphaned by the traumatic events of the earthquake. Mrs. Nixon was always much more interested in interactions in places like hospitals, orphanages, schools, and village squares than she was in formal dinners, banquets, or teas. On June 29, 1971, Mrs. Nixon was awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of the Sun for her humanitarian relief work in Peru. Mrs. Velasco herself presented the award to Mrs. Nixon at the Peruvian Embassy in D.C. This is the Peruvian government's highest honor. Mrs. Nixon characteristically would not accept this award for herself, but instead declared,
"I accept it for the people of the United States who were glad to lend a helping hand to their neighbors in distress."
In sum, Mrs. Nixon was the first First Lady to serve as an official representative of the U.S. abroad. Due to her extensive travel, warm nature, and inclusive, open attitude towards people globally, her volunteer efforts in Peru were an international success. But it was the personal, non-governmental nature of Mrs. Nixon's trip, her sincere interest in the welfare of the Peruvian people, and her authentic warmth that won hearts. The Dallas Morning News wrote of Mrs. Nixon's trip, quote, "She could have been above all the tragedy, but instead, for a few hours, she became part of the tragedy, and her face and voice showed it." Mrs. Nixon was a lifelong, strong proponent of volunteerism for countless organizations. She felt it was limiting to have only one, quote, signature project. Instead, she always said, quote, "People are my project." Her genuine care and concern for the victims of the Great Peruvian Earthquake of 1970 exemplifies Pat Nixon's person-to-person humanitarian efforts. In the midst of this terrible natural disaster, Pat Nixon used her platform as First Lady to model not only volunteerism, but also empathy and concern for one's neighbor on a global stage.
Heath Lee, thank you so much for that comprehensive and moving account. During that mercy mission, reporters pointed out to Mrs. Nixon that most Peruvians didn't understand anything she said. She replied, "Even if people can't speak your language, they can tell if you have love in your heart." And those are the words that President Nixon and Tricia and Julie chose for her epitaph here at the Nixon Library. During an interview in 1960, Pat Nixon called to mind a quotation from George Bernard Shaw that she had memorized when it made an impression on her in high school. "The worst sin toward our fellow creatures is not to hate them, but to be indifferent to them." For Pat Nixon, volunteerism wasn't a cause, it was her life. She understood the dignity of work and the pragmatic compassion of working people because she was one. She wanted to use her position as First Lady to focus attention on the too often unnoticed and unsung sacrifices and daily heroism of those who give up their own precious free time in order to help others and make communities better places to live. People were her project, and the stakes were high. She said, "Our success as a nation depends on our willingness to give generously of ourselves for the welfare and enrichment of the lives of others." Her celebration of volunteerism, that perhaps is Pat Nixon's most important and enduring legacy.